Hey, welcome everyone. We're going to today be talking about pruning trees and shrubs. Mostly trees is what we'll focus on today, and a lot on what you can do for fruit trees, but a lot of this will be applicable to other types of trees as well, and shrubs and bushes too. Um, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here. So we see here some examples of before and after prunings. Here's a fairly large tree and some smaller fruit trees here. Let's start by looking at what you will gain by pruning and what you want to prune off of a tree. You can see any dead or diseased branches. Of course, dead branches and injured branches can be caused by a lot of things, including disease and insects, animals, storms, and other things. Branches that rub together, which is not really illustrated here, but that can create damage or make the tree susceptible to disease, suckers, and which you see here and here, as well as here and here, which are those long, straight, usually thinner branches on trees that are not very useful. They don't produce a lot of good fruit, or they're not usually quite as strong as some of the other branches, so they're good to remove. Also, branches, you can see in this illustration, they're cutting off some branches to promote airflow around the tree, as well as increasing light levels to some of those lower branches and more interior branches. And also, you can encourage growth in some cases with some pruning, which is good for apple trees, but also things like hedges and topiaries and bonsais, which we're not going to get into today. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that you will find useful in pruning trees and shrubs. First, these small handheld shears. There are bypass pruners and anvil pruners. I find, and others have recommended to me in the past, these bypass pruners or bypass shears over the anvil type, because they produce a cleaner cut than these anvil ones, which can sometimes not quite cut all the way through, and then you end up tearing it, the branch that you're trying to remove, which can not look as good, but also open the tree up for viruses or other insect damage. These shear type bypass shears are generally a better option. And also then these lopper shears is what they're called, give you much more leverage and allow you to do bigger branches. These smaller ones you can generally do up to about an inch, 3/4 of an inch, maybe an inch with the softer wood. These lopping shears you can certainly do easily an inch, and maybe up to an inch and a half without too much trouble usually. Then for larger types of branches, you'll have to get into saws. These are pruning saws. There are ones that are curved to varying degrees, as well as straight-edged saws, specifically for pruning. And they come in different, with different numbers of teeth per inch. That are some that are finer for, especially for smaller branches, and some that are have coarser teeth, which will maybe go a little more quickly and be good for larger branches, but are also a little bit rougher, leave a little bit rougher surface on the, after you've cut the branch off. Then there are pole saws, which are good for reaching higher up, and they also have a pruning saw type blade usually, and some of them also have a down here on either side. I prefer them on this side, of shear type piece where you can clip off smaller branches instead of using the saw, which doesn't work as well for the smaller branches. Although if you're going to be doing a lot of pruning, like many trees or over year after year, you might want to consider standalone pole saw and a standalone clipper to reach up to those higher branches. And the pruning saws are good for when you have to reach up above your shoulder height to prune a branch off, because they're curved and they will help keep the saw on the branch, but also get a little bit of the back and forth motion more easily than something like the straight edge pruning saw or this type saw here, which is a Beau saw, which is pretty common, and it's good for other types of applications as well. And when I do pruning, I have a pole saw like this, as well as a Beau saw, and I use the Beau saw for a lot of those lower down branches myself, and it works pretty well. Although if I'm going to be doing a lot more pruning at some point, I'll probably invest in a not too expensive, smaller, handheld pruning saw. And for the really larger prunings, where you get up beyond much more than 2 or 3 inches, you might need to use a chainsaw, and that is beyond the scope of this talk today. And unless you're really comfortable with a chainsaw and have experience with it, you might want to leave that scale of pruning to a professional, or take a class on how to use a chainsaw or something like that. We saw these 2 illustrations earlier. We're going to start talking about when to prune, and then get into some techniques of pruning. So when to prune different kinds of trees and bushes. Generally speaking, the best time for most trees and bushes is in the late dormant season, which is late winter or early spring, before a tree has really started to awaken out of dormancy and have the buds start to grow and then leaf out, because it is dormant and will be less likely to be damaged. And then also it will enter the growing season and start healing up the wound that is caused by removing any live branches that you need to remove, and healing over any dead branch stubs that you've cut off as well. Exceptions to that are maples, except box elders, which have sap that bleeds readily. And also included in that category would be butternuts and walnuts, as well as birches. And it's best to prune these types of trees after the leaves are fully expanded in the late spring or very early summer. Also, trees and shrubs that bloom on last year's growth, for example, lilacs, forsythia, and flowering cherry are examples of this. You want to prune after they've flowered. so that you get those flowers, and any fruit will grow on those after those flowers were pollinated. And you don't obviously want to prune those off. So techniques, let's see. Generally, you want to remember the three Ds, first of all. So diseased, dead, and damaged wood are the things you want to remove first when you're starting to prune a tree. And because of obviously dead and damaged wood, well, dead wood is not doing the tree any good and may be harming it. Diseased and damaged wood and branches may likely die soon and make the trees susceptible to further damage or disease. So you want to remove all of that. And then you want to consider the shape of the tree. So you can see here, generally you want a nice cone sort of shape. This isn't exactly a cone, but a nice rounded cone sort of shape. So you can see this illustration, all these red marks are what they're trimming during pruning to promote and maintain that shape in this tree. And from a very early stage, you can start pruning trees and training them to the shape that you want. And you can see here, when you've purchased a tree from a nursery, you plant it in your yard or orchard or wherever you're going to place it. You want to start training it right away, and have a strong, in most cases, leader branch, a centralized leader branch, although there are exceptions to that with some fruit trees, and then branches out from there with good airflow and letting in light to some of those interior branches, as opposed to having too much on top and too close together, where you might have weaker branch joints, and where it's more closed in, and which reduces airflow and light levels to those interior branches. And the importance of having the light and increased airflow is that it helps with growth, but also preventing diseases too, like scab and scale on leaves, because having that more open space will allow leaves to dry out better and more quickly. Yes, moving on. When you have to remove a larger branch, or you want to cut a branch fully off, you'll want to cut it back to the branch collar swelling, which is right up close to the trunk or the main branch that you're cutting it off of. And for larger branches, you're going to want to make a cut here first, which helps prevent tearing of the bark down here, especially down here with what's going to remain. And then you cut through here so that you then have a stub remaining with not much weight on it. Then you're able to easily just cut straight off here and have a smooth, straight cut very easily, that the tree can then cover over with new growth going forward. And with larger branches, that covering may take a couple of years or even 3 or 4 years, depending on the size of the branch. But it's okay. You don't actually have to cover that with any sealant or anything. Trees are very good at, especially healthier trees, at covering those over and sealing them up. And then they'll be just fine with that. And generally, most of the cuts you are going to do for pruning will be of this type, not necessarily with 3 cuts, but you'll be cutting it back to main branch, and those are called thinning cuts. But another type of cut is called a heading cut, where you remove only part of a branch, which you can see a little bit here on the right, where you cut the end of a branch off. And what you want to do that is, with that, is to cut it just 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch ahead of one of these buds, which will be pretty obvious to see in most trees. And that this type of cut will promote new growth. By cutting off the ends, you'll trigger some of these other buds to start growing, and it can also help maintain the growth, maintain the shape, of a tree. And you always want to consider the direction of these buds when you cut off the tree, so that you can maintain that shape, or whatever shape you're trying to do. So some further resources of where you can go for more information and more detailed information than what we were able to provide today. You can go to UVM Extension, and these 3 websites are good. This first one is a good general website for a lot of information. The second one talks specifically about fruit trees. And then something we didn't talk a lot about today is bushes, and specifically, in this case, berry bushes, with this website, and how to prune those and help maintain those bushes so that they're healthy and will produce a lot of fruit. And then one final resource that you can explore is at the University of Minnesota Extension, where they have this a lot of good information, and they have a series of 3 videos specifically on pruning apple trees. And they talk about some of the basic pruning elements and principles, and actually show you how to do some of that in that video, which is really helpful. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to next time.